The conference room fell silent as laughter died on their lips. Nobody expected the quiet girl from accounting to accept the dare. And nobody could have imagined what would happen next. Sarah Mitchell had worked at Hartwell Industries for 3 years. Practically invisible among the sea of ambitious executives and cutthroat salespeople. At 28, she kept her head down, ate lunch alone at her desk, and never attended the company happy hours where careers were made and broken over martinis and forced laughter. She was the girl people forgot to invite to meetings. The one whose name was perpetually mispronounced at all hands gatherings, which made it all the more surprising when Marcus Chen, the wunderkind VP who drove a Tesla and wore watches worth more than Sarah's annual salary, pointed at her during the company's annual holiday party. "Hey, you," he called out, his voice carrying across the hotel ballroom. "The piano girl. I heard you play." Sarah felt her cheeks burn as hundreds of faces turned toward her. She clutched her glass of sparkling water tighter, wishing she could dissolve into the floor. "I don't," she started. "Come on," Marcus pressed, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Show us what you've got." Unless it was all talk. His buddies snickered, and Sarah recognized the game immediately. She'd seen it played a dozen times with other quiet employees. The public humiliation disguised as good-natured fun. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah hadn't just played piano. She'd been a prodigy once, performing at Carnegie Hall at 15, headed for Juilliard with a full scholarship. But that was before her mother's cancer diagnosis, before the medical bills that swallowed every dollar, before she'd traded her dreams for a steady paycheck with health insurance. She should have said no. Every fiber of her being screamed to decline politely and disappear into the crowd. But something in Marcus's smirk, the casual cruelty of someone who'd never known real hardship, made her set down her glass and walk toward the grand piano that sat largely decorative at the edge of the dance floor. The crowd parted. Someone whistled mockingly. Sarah heard a woman whisper, "This is going to be painful." She sat down at the bench, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. The ivory felt cool and familiar, like coming home after a long exile. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. Not the loss, not the sacrifice, but the pure, untainted love she'd once had for music. And then she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor drifted through the ballroom, delicate and haunting. The laughter died instantly. Sarah's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that comes only from thousands of hours of practice. From a soul that speaks more eloquently through music than words. She didn't play it as it was written. She played it as she'd lived. It each note infused with 3 years of invisible tears of dreams deferred. Of loving someone enough to let your own life become smaller so theirs could continue. The melody swelled and broke, rose and fell, carrying with it every unspoken word she'd swallowed down at her cubicle. Every lonely lunch hour, every moment she'd convinced herself that being forgotten was easier than being seen. The piece transformed under her hands. What began as Chopin became something else entirely. A conversation between who she'd been and who she'd become, between ambition and sacrifice, between the life she'd imagined and the love that had reshaped her. She wove in fragments of her mother's favorite hymn. The lullaby she'd sung when Sarah was small. The birthday song she'd played at her mother's bedside during that final terrible year. In the back of the room, Jonathan Hartwell, Sr., the 73-year-old founder and CEO, had been making his obligatory appearance at the party. He'd planned to stay 15 minutes, shake a few hands, and return to his penthouse apartment where he lived alone with his regrets. He'd built an empire but buried his wife of 47 years just 6 months ago. And every holiday gathering felt like sandpaper against his grief. But the music stopped him cold. He'd heard this piece before. Elizabeth, his late wife, had loved Chopin. But this version, this interpretation, it captured something he hadn't been able to articulate even to himself. It was about the beauty of sacrifice, the dignity in choosing love over ambition, the way some people make themselves smaller so others can grow. Elizabeth had done that for him in the early days when he'd been building Hartwell Industries from nothing. Working 100-hour weeks, she'd set aside her own teaching career to hold their family together. She'd never complained, never made him feel guilty, but in his success, he'd somehow forgotten to tell her thank you. He'd forgotten to tell her that he saw her, really saw her, and now she was gone, and all his billions couldn't buy back a single conversation. The music built toward its climax, and Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks as Sarah's playing articulated the grief he'd kept locked away, giving voice to the love and regret that had been strangling him for 6 months. Around him, he noticed others crying, too, the older accountant whose son had special needs. The marketing director who turned down a dream job to care for her aging parents. The custodian who worked nights to put his daughter through medical school. All the invisible people seeing themselves reflected in Sarah's music. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was profound. Sarah kept her hands on the keys, her eyes still closed, afraid to open them and face the mockery she'd surely earned for being too much. Too dramatic, too emotional. Then someone started clapping. It was Jonathan, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. Others joined. Not the polite golf clap of corporate obligation, but real sustained applause that filled the ballroom. Marcus Chen stood frozen, his expression caught between shame and shock. Sarah opened her eyes to find Jonathan Hartwell standing beside the piano, tears still wet on his face. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Sarah Mitchell, sir, I work in accounts payable." "Not anymore, you don't." He pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. "HR will contact you Monday. You're being transferred to our corporate philanthropy division. We need someone with actual heart running it. Triple your current salary, and we're setting up a music scholarship program. You'll help select recipients." He paused, his voice breaking. "People who sacrificed their dreams for love. People like you. Like my Elizabeth." He turned to address the room, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built something from nothing. "This young woman just taught me something I'd forgotten. Real wealth isn't measured in stock options or corner offices. It's measured in what we're willing to give up for the people we love." Marcus Chen had quietly disappeared into the crowd. Later, after the party wound down, Sarah stood in the parking lot, her mind still reeling. Her phone buzzed. Her mother texting from her apartment uptown where she'd been cancer-free for 2 years now. "How was the party, sweetheart?" Sarah looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights, and smiled. "Mom," she typed back. "I think I just got everything back that I thought I'd lost." She'd learned something that night, too. Sacrifice wasn't about losing yourself. It was about discovering that love could expand you in ways success never could. Her dreams hadn't died. They'd just been waiting for the right moment to transform into something more beautiful than she'd ever imagined. Inside her purse, her phone buzzed again. An email from Jonathan's assistant. The Jonathan and Elizabeth Hartwell Foundation for Artistic Excellence welcomes you aboard. Sarah got in her car, turned on the radio, and drove home through the winter night. Tomorrow she'd call her old piano teacher. Tomorrow she'd start playing again. Not because she had to prove anything to anyone, but because music had always been her truest voice. And finally, after 3 years of silence, she had something worth saying.